The sand-dusted streets of Copper Creek seemed to part for her as Florence Blackburn made her way through town, her gaze fixed ahead with an intensity that kept curious onlookers at bay. The year was 1878, and the Arizona Territory had seen its share of hardship, but few wore their suffering as visibly as Florence did. Her face, though still youthful at 26, appeared carved from stone, beautiful in its severity, but absent the softness that laughter brings to human features. "There she goes again," whispered Martha Coleman from the general store porch. "That poor woman hasn't cracked a smile since she arrived 3 years ago." "Can you blame her?" replied Harriet Simmons. "After what happened at Silver Creek?" Florence heard the whispers, but had long since trained herself to ignore them. The basket of supplies hung heavy on her arm as she headed toward the edge of town where her small homestead waited. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and she quickened her pace, eager to reach home before darkness fell. "Madam, you dropped this." The deep voice came from behind her, and Florence turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the sun. As he stepped forward, she saw a man she didn't recognize, not unusual in a town that served as a waypoint for cattle drives and travelers heading west. His clothes marked him as a cowboy-worn leather chaps, a dusty hat pushed back on his head, and a bandana loosely tied around his neck. In his outstretched hand was her handkerchief, the only fine thing she still possessed from her previous life. "Thank you," she said, taking it without meeting his eyes. "Name's Wade Yates," he said, tipping his hat. "Just signed on with the Carson outfit north of town." Florence nodded curtly, tucking the handkerchief into her pocket. "Miss Blackburn," she offered, already turning to leave. "Miss Blackburn," he repeated as if testing the sound of it. "You know, it's customary where I come from to look a man in the eye when he introduces himself." Florence stiffened. "Well, Mr. Yates, perhaps you'll find our customs here in Copper Creek more to your liking with time. Good day." As she walked away, she could feel his eyes on her back. "I'll see you smile one day, Miss Blackburn," he called after her. "I'm a patient man. I'll wait until you do." Florence didn't turn around, but something in his voice, not mockery, but a genuine warmth, caused an unexpected flutter in her chest. She dismissed it immediately. Men had made promises to her before, promises that turned to dust when tested. The next morning dawned clear and hot, the kind of day that seemed to stretch endlessly across the Arizona desert. Florence rose before the sun, as was her habit, to tend to her small vegetable garden and the few chickens that provided her with eggs. The homestead wasn't much a one-room cabin with a lean-to addition she'd built herself, sitting on a plot of land just large enough to grow what she needed to survive. Independence had been hard won, and Florence guarded it fiercely. After fleeing Silver Creek, she'd arrived in Copper Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and a determination never to rely on anyone again. She'd worked as a seamstress, saving every penny until she could purchase this small piece of land. It wasn't much, but it was hers, free and clear. As she worked in the garden, pulling weeds from between rows of beans and tomatoes, she heard the distinctive sound of hooves approaching. Visitors were rare and unwelcome. Florence straightened, wiping dirt from her hands onto her apron as she watched a rider approach. Even at a distance, she recognized Wade Yates by his posture, straight-backed yet somehow at ease in the saddle. His horse, a handsome chestnut gelding, trotted up to her fence line and stopped. "Morning, Miss Blackburn," he called, dismounting in one fluid motion. Florence crossed her arms. "Mr. Yates, I don't recall inviting you to my property." He smiled, and Florence noticed that his eyes crinkled at the corners when he did so. "No invitation, madam. Just passing by on my way to the Carson place and thought I'd check if you needed any help with anything. I manage quite well on my own, thank you." Wade looked around, taking in the neat rows of vegetables, the chicken coop, and the well-maintained cabin. "I can see that. Fine place you got here." There was genuine admiration in his voice, not the patronizing tone men often used when speaking to a woman living alone. "Your roof could use some patching before the summer storms hit," he added, nodding toward a section of shingles that had begun to curl at the edges. Florence followed his gaze, irritated because he was right. She'd noticed the problem weeks ago, but hadn't yet figured out how to fix it herself. Hiring help was out of the question. Her meager savings were set aside for emergencies only. "I'll tend to it," she said firmly. Wade nodded, not pushing the issue. "Well, if you change your mind, I'm handy with a hammer." He started back toward his horse, then paused. "Almost forgot why I stopped. Mrs. Coleman at the general store asked me to deliver this." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "She said your order came in on yesterday's stage, but you'd already left town." Florence hesitated before approaching the fence to take the package. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and she withdrew her hand quickly. "Thank Mrs. Coleman for me," she said, stepping back. Wade tipped his hat. "Will do. Good day, Miss Blackburn." As he mounted his horse, he added, still waiting on that smile. Florence turned away without responding, but once he was out of sight, she allowed herself a small shake of her head. The man was persistent. She'd give him that. The package contained thread and needles for her sewing work, small mending jobs that supplemented the income from her garden produce. As she returned to her weeding, Florence found her thoughts drifting to Wade Yates more often than she cared to admit. 3 days passed without another visit from the cowboy, and Florence told herself she was relieved. She had no room in her life for distractions, especially not in the form of a man with kind eyes and an easy smile. The memories of how quickly kindness could turn to cruelty were still too fresh, even after 3 years. On the 4th day, Florence headed into town with a basket of vegetables to sell and clothes she'd mended for the Peterson family. The summer heat was intensifying, making the walk more grueling than usual. By the time she reached Main Street, her dress was sticking to her back, and wisps of hair had escaped her severe bun. The town was busier than normal. A cattle drive had arrived the previous day, bringing cowboys with money to spend and a thirst to quench. Florence kept her head down as she passed the saloon, ignoring the calls and whistles from men lounging on the porch. "Look at that one, cold as ice," one voice said, loud enough for her to hear. "Bet I could warm her up," another replied, followed by laughter. Florence quickened her pace, her knuckles white around the handle of her basket. She was nearly past the saloon when a man stepped directly into her path, reeking of whiskey despite the early hour. "Where you rushing off to, pretty lady?" he slurred, reaching for her arm. Florence stepped back, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she said firmly, attempting to move around him. The man moved with her, blocking her path again. "Now don't be unfriendly, just looking for some company." The lady said, "Excuse me." The voice came from behind her, and Florence didn't need to turn to know it belonged to Wade Yates. The drunk cowboy looked over her shoulder, his bleary eyes narrowing. "This ain't your business, Yates." "I'm making it my business," Wade replied, his voice level but carrying an unmistakable edge. Florence felt him step beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could move behind him if needed. The drunk cowboy seemed to consider his options, then spat in the dirt. "Ain't worth the trouble anyway," he muttered, stumbling back toward the saloon. Only when he was gone did Florence release the breath she'd been holding. She turned to Wade, finding his expression concerned but not pitying. "Are you all right, Miss Blackburn?" "Yes," she said, and then, because it seemed necessary, "Thank you." Wade nodded, his eyes scanning the street before returning to her face. "Where are you headed? I'd be happy to walk with you." Florence's instinct was to refuse, to assert her independence as she always did. But the encounter had rattled her more than she wanted to admit, and Wade's presence was oddly reassuring. "I'm going to the general store, and then to deliver these to the Petersons," she said, nodding to her basket. "Mind if I tag along? I need supplies myself." His casual tone suggested he was asking for his own convenience rather than offering protection, and Florence appreciated the pretense. It allowed her to nod without feeling like she was accepting charity. They walked side by side down the street, Wade adjusting his long stride to match hers. He kept a respectful distance between them, but Florence was acutely aware of his presence. The subtle scent of leather and sun-warmed skin, the confidence in his gait. "How are you finding Copper Creek, Mr. Yates?" she asked, surprising herself by initiating conversation. It's a decent town. People are friendly enough, he replied. Except for present company, of course. Florence glanced at him sharply, but found him grinning. That was a joke, Miss Blackburn. I'm aware of what jokes are, Mr. Yates. Could have fooled me, he said, but his tone remained light, teasing rather than critical. At the general store, Mrs. Coleman greeted them with poorly concealed interest, her eyes darting between Florence and Wade as if trying to solve a puzzle. Miss Blackburn, Mr. Yates, she said. What a pleasant surprise to see you two together. Just happened to be heading the same way, Mrs. Coleman, Wade explained, moving to examine a display of tools while Florence arranged to sell her vegetables. The transaction complete, Florence gathered her basket and waited as Wade purchased supplies nails, a small pot of paint, and a length of rope. Outside, they continued their walk toward the Peterson house at the north end of town. Carson's working you hard? Florence asked, nodding to the calluses on his hands that hadn't been there when they first met. Wade glanced down at his palms. Hard enough. Mending fences mostly, breaking some new horses. Nothing I'm not used to. You've been a cowboy long? Since I was 18. Started on my father's ranch in Texas, then headed west after he passed. Been working cattle drives and ranch jobs ever since. I'm sorry about your father, Florence said automatically. Wade shrugged. It was 5 years ago. He lived a good life, taught me everything I know about horses and cattle. Can't ask for much more than that. There was a simplicity to his acceptance that Florence envied. Her own losses felt like open wounds, refusing to heal properly no matter how much time passed. What about you? Wade asked. You from around these parts originally? Florence tensed. She never discussed her past, had made it a rule when she arrived in Copper Creek to reinvent herself without the weight of what had happened. No, she said shortly. Wade seemed to sense her discomfort. Well, wherever you're from, they taught you to grow fine tomatoes. Mrs. Coleman couldn't stop talking about the ones you brought in last week. The gentle change of subject allowed Florence to relax slightly. They continued in companionable silence until they reached the Peterson house, where Florence delivered the mended clothes to a grateful Mrs. Peterson. As they turned to head back toward the center of town, dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon, promising an afternoon thunderstorm. We should hurry, Florence said, eyeing the clouds with concern. Those storms move fast. Wade looked up at the sky. Too fast. We won't make it back to town before it hits. He scanned the area, then pointed to a small stable about 100 yards off the main road. We can wait it out there. Florence hesitated. Being alone with a man, even one who had shown nothing but respect, went against every rule she'd set for herself. A distant rumble of thunder made the decision for her. All right, she agreed reluctantly. They reached the stable just as the first heavy drops began to fall. It was abandoned but still solid, with a partial roof that would keep them dry. Wade led his horse inside, removing the saddle to make the animal more comfortable. Florence stood near the entrance, watching as the rain intensified, transforming from scattered drops to sheets of water in minutes. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she wrapped her arms around herself. Here, Wade said, approaching with a blanket from his saddlebag. It's clean, I promise. Florence accepted it after a moment's hesitation, draping it around her shoulders. Thank you. They sat on hay bales near the entrance, watching the downpour. The sound of rain on the partial roof created a drumming that made conversation difficult, forcing them into silence. Florence found herself studying Wade when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands moved with confident precision as he checked his saddle for any damage from the rain. When the thunder crashed particularly loud overhead, Florence flinched involuntarily. Not fond of storms? Wade asked, his voice gentle. Florence shook her head. They remind me of... She stopped herself, surprised at how close she'd come to sharing something personal. Wade didn't press. Instead, he said, My mother was terrified of them. Used to hide under the bed when I was a boy. My father would get down on the floor with her, tell her stories until the storm passed. The image was so unexpected and tender that Florence felt something loosen in her chest. That's sweet, He loved her something fierce, Wade said, a smile playing at his lips. Said she was the sun and moon to him, even when she was being unreasonable, which, according to him, was most of the time. Florence found herself wanting to hear more. They sound like they were happy. They had their share of hard times, Wade said. Drought years when we nearly lost the ranch, winters when the cattle froze in the fields. But they faced it together. He looked at her directly. That's the secret, I think. Having someone to stand with you when the storms come. The words hung between them as the rain continued to fall. Florence looked away first, unnerved by how deeply his simple philosophy resonated with her. And you? She asked, redirecting the conversation. No wife waiting somewhere? Wade shook his head. Never found the right woman. Or maybe I did and was too foolish to realize it at the time. He stretched his long legs out in front of him. What about you? No husband or beau wondering where you are right now? No, Florence said flatly, and I prefer it that way. Wade studied her for a moment. Someone hurt you badly, he said, not a question, but a quiet observation. Florence stiffened. Mr. Yates. Wade, he corrected. After sheltering from a storm together, I think we can use first names, don't you? Florence didn't respond to that. My past is my own business. Fair enough, he agreed easily. But whatever happened, whoever hurt you, they don't get to keep taking from you forever. Florence looked at him sharply. What do you mean? Wade gestured vaguely. Joy, laughter, trust, those belong to you, not to your past. The simplicity with which he stated it, as if it were an obvious truth rather than an impossible ideal, left Florence momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, the rain began to slacken and sunlight broke through the clouds. Looks like we survived, Wade said, standing and offering his hand to help her up. Florence ignored the offered hand, rising on her own. She returned the blanket, careful not to let their fingers touch. Thank you for the shelter, she said formally, trying to rebuild the wall his words had temporarily breached. Wade accepted the blanket with a nod. Anytime, Florence. The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her, but she didn't correct him. As they walked back to town, the fresh washed air filled with the scent of wet earth and sage, Florence found herself wondering what it would be like to face life's storms with someone like Wade Yates at her side. The thought frightened her more than any thundercloud ever could. The following week brought scorching heat to Copper Creek, the kind that seemed to shimmer visibly above the ground and drove people to seek shelter during the worst of the afternoon sun. Florence's garden required constant attention to prevent the precious vegetables from withering, forcing her to work in the early morning hours and again in the evening. It was during one such evening session, as she carefully watered each plant, that she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her pulse quickened as Wade appeared, leading his horse rather than riding it. He carried a burlap sack over one shoulder. Evening, Florence, he called, stopping at her fence. She straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. Mr. Yates. Still with the formalities? He smiled, seemingly unbothered. I brought you something. Florence approached the fence cautiously. What is it? Wade held up the sack. Roofing shingles, and before you protest, they're leftovers from repairs at the Carson place. Would have gone to waste otherwise. Florence frowned. I told you I would handle my roof. And you still can, Wade said reasonably. I'm just providing materials. Carson was going to throw these out, and I thought of your cabin. Florence hesitated. The roof did need fixing before the next rainstorm, and purchasing new shingles would deplete her carefully managed savings. I suppose I could use them, she conceded finally. Wade's smile widened. Excellent. Mind if I set them by your tool shed? Florence nodded, and he entered the yard, careful to close the gate behind him. As he placed the shingles near her small shed, he casually asked, Your tomatoes holding up in this heat? Barely, Florence admitted, returning to her watering. I've been giving them extra water morning and night. Wade knelt beside her garden, examining the plants with a knowledgeable eye. My mother used to put eggshells around the base of her tomatoes, said the calcium helped them through the hot spells. I've heard that, Florence said. I save my eggshells for that purpose. They fell into a surprisingly comfortable conversation about gardening techniques, with Wade sharing his mother's wisdom and Florence describing the methods she'd developed through trial and error. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across her property, Florence realized they'd been talking for nearly an hour. "I should let you get back to your evening," Wade said, seeming to read her thoughts. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Though I wonder if I might impose on your hospitality one more time." Florence raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Could I trouble you for a drink of water before I head back? It's a fair distance to the Carson place." It was a reasonable request, especially given the heat and the gift of shingles. Florence nodded and led the way to the well near her cabin. She drew fresh water into a cup and handed it to him, watching as he drank deeply. "Thank you," he said, returning the cup. "Best water I've tasted in Arizona territory." Florence almost smiled at the exaggeration. "You're welcome." Wade lingered a moment longer, his eyes taking in her face as if searching for something. "I meant what I said that first day. You know, what was that? That I'd wait to see you smile." His voice was soft, almost reverent. "I'm a patient man, Florence Blackburn." Before she could respond, he tipped his hat and turned to his horse. Florence watched him ride away, a strange mix of emotions churning within her wariness, curiosity, and something dangerously close to hope. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the desert sounds outside her window, Florence found herself thinking about Wade's words. Joy, laughter, trust. Those belong to you, not to your past. She had once been a person who smiled easily, who trusted openly. That Florence seemed like a stranger now, a naive girl who hadn't yet learned how quickly happiness could be shattered. 3 years ago, she had arrived in Copper Creek determined never to be vulnerable again. She had built walls around her heart, brick by brick, until they seemed impenetrable. And now, this cowboy with his kind eyes and patient manner was suggesting those walls might be a prison rather than protection. The thought kept her awake far into the night. The next morning, Florence woke with the sunrise and a decision. She would fix her roof today, using the shingles Wade had brought. The physical labor would clear her mind of these unsettling thoughts. After a quick breakfast, she gathered her tools and dragged the ladder from behind her shed. It was an old ladder, sturdy enough but heavy for her to maneuver alone. With considerable effort, she positioned it against the side of her cabin and climbed up to assess the damage. As Wade had noted, several shingles had curled and cracked, leaving the underlying structure vulnerable to water damage. Florence carefully removed the first damaged shingle, sweat already beading on her forehead despite the early hour. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the approach of a rider until a voice called up to her. "That ladder doesn't look too stable," Florence started, nearly losing her balance. She clutched the roof edge and looked down to see Wade dismounting from his horse. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, embarrassment making her tone sharper than intended. Wade approached the ladder, eyeing it critically. "Came to check if the shingles would work for you. Good thing I did." He put a hand on the ladder, which was indeed wobbling slightly. "This isn't safe, Florence." "It's worked fine for 3 years," she replied defensively. "Maybe for hanging washing, not for roof repairs." Wade kept his hand on the ladder, stabilizing it. "Come down, please, before you break your neck." Something in his voice, concern without condescension, made Florence comply. She descended carefully, aware of his steady hand on the ladder. Once on solid ground, she crossed her arms. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Yates, but as I've told you before, I manage quite well on my own." Wade nodded, his expression serious. "You do. Better than most. But there's no shame in accepting help for tasks that are safer with 2 people." He looked up at the roof. "I'm offering my labor, nothing more. You can direct me, tell me exactly how you want it done." Florence hesitated. The roof did need fixing, and the task would be not only safer, but quicker with assistance. Still, accepting help felt like admitting weakness. As if reading her thoughts, Wade added softly, "Strength isn't about doing everything alone, Florence. Sometimes it's about knowing when to let someone lend a hand." Florence studied him, trying to discern his true motives. She found nothing in his expression but sincerity and that same patient kindness he'd shown from the beginning. "Very well," she said finally. "But I'll work alongside you." Wade's face broke into a smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They spent the morning working on the roof together, with Florence instructing and Wade following her lead, while occasionally offering suggestions from his own experience. Despite her initial reservations, Florence found the work went smoothly. Wade was skilled with his hands and respectful of her property, treating each task with care. By midday, the worst sections had been repaired, and they paused for water. Florence had also prepared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples, which she somewhat reluctantly invited Wade to share. They sat in the shade of her porch, the summer heat making the cool water taste especially sweet. Wade ate with appreciation, complimenting her bread. "Did you bake this yourself?" he asked between bites. Florence nodded. "Yesterday morning." "It's excellent. Reminds me of my mother's." "You mention your mother often," Florence observed. Wade smiled. "She was a remarkable woman. Taught me to respect women, to cook for myself, and to always carry a clean handkerchief." He chuckled at some private memory. "She passed 2 years after my father. Heart gave out, though I always thought it was partly from missing him." There was no bitterness in his voice, only a gentle acceptance that Florence envied. "My mother died when I was 12, she found herself saying. "Influenza." It was the first personal detail she had shared with him, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. Wade nodded, his eyes soft with understanding. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "That's young to lose a mother." "My father did his best," Florence continued, surprising herself with the desire to share more. "He was a banker in Denver, raised me to be independent, educated." Wade waited, not pushing but making space for her to continue if she wished. Florence hesitated, then added, "He died 4 years ago. That's when things changed." She stopped there, unwilling to venture further into the darkness that had followed her father's death. Wade seemed to sense the boundary and didn't press. "He sounds like a good man," he said instead, "to raise a daughter as capable as you." The compliment, delivered without flattery, warmed something in Florence's chest. "He was," she agreed quietly. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then returned to work. By late afternoon, the roof was completely repaired, with every damaged shingle replaced and secured. "That should hold through many storms," Wade said with satisfaction as they put away the tools. Florence surveyed their work, genuinely pleased with the results. "Yes, it will. Thank you for your help." Wade brushed off his hands and looked at her directly. "You're welcome, Florence. It was my pleasure." There was something in his gaze, a warmth, an invitation that made Florence look away first. She busied herself with gathering the remaining shingles, storing them in her shed for future repairs. When she returned, Wade was preparing to leave, tightening his horse's saddle girth. "Will you be in town for the Founders' Day celebration next weekend?" he asked casually. Florence shook her head. "I don't attend town gatherings." "Never?" "Not in 3 years," she confirmed. Wade considered this. "Would you consider making an exception? I hear there's to be music and dancing under the stars." Florence felt a momentary yearning so intense it almost took her breath away. Once she had loved dancing more than anything. Before. "No," she said firmly, "but thank you for the invitation." Wade nodded, accepting her refusal without argument. He mounted his horse with easy grace. "If you change your mind," he said, "I'll be there. Might even save you a dance." With a tip of his hat, he rode away, leaving Florence standing in her yard with the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted between them. She had revealed pieces of herself today, small though they were, and he had accepted them without judgment. It was terrifying and, in some small measure, exhilarating. The week leading up to Founders' Day brought increased activity to Copper Creek. Bunting appeared on storefronts, and a platform for musicians was constructed in the town square. Florence observed the preparations with detached interest during her necessary trips to town, maintaining her resolve to avoid the celebration itself. On Founder's Day morning, Florence was surprised by a knock at her door. She opened it to find Mrs. Coleman standing on her porch, holding a package. "Good morning, Florence," the older woman said cheerfully. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Florence replied, though visitors were rare enough to be unsettling. "Would you like to come in?" Mrs. Coleman entered, looking around the neat cabin with approval. "Such a lovely home you've made here, so organized and clean." "Thank you," Florence said, gesturing for her visitor to sit at the small table. "Can I offer you tea?" "That would be lovely, dear." As Florence prepared the tea, Mrs. Coleman placed the package on the table. "I've brought something for you to consider," she said, "for tonight's celebration." Florence paused in her tea-making. "That's very kind, but I don't plan to attend." Mrs. Coleman smiled knowingly. "So you've said every year, but I thought perhaps this time might be different." She pushed the package toward Florence. "A certain cowboy mentioned you might need some persuading." Florence felt heat rise to her cheeks. Mr. Yates should mind his own business. "Oh, he wasn't presumptuous," Mrs. Coleman assured her. "Simply said that if I happened to see you, I might mention that the celebration wouldn't be complete without all of Copper Creek's residents." Florence brought the tea to the table, her movements measured and precise. "Mrs. Coleman, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not comfortable in crowds." The older woman sipped her tea before responding. "I understand, dear. More than you might think." She set down her cup. "Did you know I didn't leave my house for nearly a year after Mr. Coleman passed?" Florence looked up in surprise. Mrs. Coleman was one of the most social people in town, always at the center of community events. "Grief does strange things to us," Mrs. Coleman continued, "makes us build walls to protect what's left of our hearts." Her eyes, kind but shrewd, held Florence's. "But walls keep out the good along with the bad, dear." Florence looked down at her tea, unsure how to respond. "Open the package," Mrs. Coleman urged gently. "No obligation, just look." With reluctant hands, Florence untied the string and folded back the brown paper. Inside was a dress not new but well cared for, in a soft shade of blue that reminded Florence of summer skies. "It was my daughter's," Mrs. Coleman explained, "before she moved to California with her husband. She's about your size, I think." Florence touched the fabric lightly, feeling its quality beneath her fingers. "It's beautiful," she admitted, "but I couldn't possibly—" "It's a loan, not a gift," Mrs. Coleman interrupted with a smile. "Though if you decide to keep it, Martha would be pleased. She always said blue was a color for women with strength in their souls." The words touched something in Florence that had been dormant for too long. She looked up at Mrs. Coleman, seeing not pity, but genuine affection in the older woman's face. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Mrs. Coleman beamed. "That's all I ask, dear." She finished her tea and stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "You know, Florence, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to try again to step back into the world and risk being hurt, because that's also how we find joy." After Mrs. Coleman left, Florence laid the dress across her bed, studying it in the sunlight streaming through her window. It had been years since she'd worn anything but the practical plain dresses she sewed for herself. This dress, with its subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs, belonged to a different life, the life she'd left behind in Denver. She closed her eyes, memories washing over her. Thomas Hargrove had been her father's business partner, 20 years her senior, but charming and respected in Denver society. After her father's death, he had been kind, supportive, offering to manage her inheritance, proposing marriage as a way to secure her future. Florence, grief-stricken and alone, had accepted. The kindness had lasted exactly 3 weeks after their wedding. Then came the control, the isolation, the discovery that her inheritance was gone, and finally, the violence. When she had confronted him about the missing money, his rage had been terrifying. She had fled in the night with nothing but a small bag of possessions, traveling as far as her meager funds would take her. Copper Creek had been the end of the line, a place where no one knew her, where she could rebuild without looking over her shoulder. She had never told anyone here the truth, letting them believe she was a widow rather than a woman who had escaped a monstrous marriage. Florence opened her eyes, looking again at the blue dress. Mrs. Coleman's words echoed in her mind, Walls keep out the good along with the bad, and then Wade's voice, joy, laughter, trust, those belong to you, not to your past. With trembling fingers, Florence reached out and touched the dress again. Perhaps just this once she could step beyond her walls. Perhaps she could reclaim a small piece of the woman she had been before. As evening approached, Florence found herself standing before her small mirror, hardly recognizing the woman reflected there. The blue dress fit surprisingly well, highlighting her slender figure and bringing out the deep amber of her eyes. She had unbraided her hair from its usual severe style, letting it fall in soft waves to her shoulders. "This is madness," she whispered to herself. Yet she couldn't deny the flutter of something like anticipation in her stomach, not just for seeing Wade, though that thought brought its own peculiar warmth, but for rejoining the world of the living, if only for one night. The walk to town seemed longer than usual, each step an opportunity to turn back. Florence nearly did so half a dozen times, but the memory of Wade's patient smile kept her moving forward. Not for him, she told herself firmly, for herself, to prove that Thomas hadn't taken everything. The sounds of music and laughter reached her before she arrived at the town square. Lanterns hung from wires strung between buildings, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Tables laden with food lined one side of the square, while a band played lively tunes on the wooden platform. Couples were already dancing, spinning, and laughing beneath the stars. Florence paused at the edge of the celebration, suddenly overwhelmed. 3 years of isolation had not prepared her for the sensory experience of so many people, so much noise and movement. She was about to retreat when a familiar voice spoke behind her. "You came." She turned to find Wade standing there, his expression one of pleasant surprise. He looked different, clean-shaven, wearing a crisp white shirt with a black vest and his best pair of denims. His hat was the same, though, and something about that small familiarity steadied her. "I almost didn't," she admitted. Wade's smile deepened. "I'm glad you changed your mind." His eyes took in her appearance, appreciation evident in his gaze. "You look beautiful, Florence." The compliment made her cheeks warm. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, broken when Wade gestured toward the celebration. "Would you like something to eat? Mrs. Peterson's apple pie is legendary." Florence nodded, grateful for the suggestion. They made their way to the food tables, where Wade procured plates of fried chicken, biscuits, and the promised apple pie. Finding a relatively quiet spot at the edge of the square, they sat on a bench to eat. Florence was conscious of the curious glances sent their way. Her presence at the celebration was noteworthy enough. Being seen with Wade Yates added another layer of interest for the townsfolk. "Ignore them," Wade said quietly, noting her discomfort. "They'll find something else to gossip about soon enough." Florence managed a small nod, focusing on her food. The pie was indeed excellent, sweet and spiced with cinnamon. She commented on it, and they fell into a conversation about cooking and baking that helped ease her tension. As they finished eating, the band struck up a waltz. Wade set aside his plate and turned to her, his expression hopeful. "Would you honor me with a dance, Florence?" The question sent a jolt of both longing and fear through her. Dancing had once been her greatest joy, but she hadn't danced since her wedding day. It's been a very long time," she said hesitantly. "Like riding a horse," Wade replied with a gentle smile. "Your body remembers, even if your mind's forgotten." He stood and offered his hand. Florence looked at it for a long moment, then, in a decision that felt monumental, placed her fingers in his palm. Wade's hand was warm and calloused, closing around hers with reassuring strength as he led her to the edge of the dancing area. "We can start here," he said, positioning himself before her, away from the crowd. His consideration touched her deeply. Wade placed his hand lightly at her waist, maintaining a respectful distance between their bodies. Florence rested her free hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath the fabric of his shirt. When they began to move, Florence was surprised by how natural it felt. Wade was a confident lead, guiding her gently through the steps of the waltz. After a few moments of concentration, muscle memory took over, and Florence found herself moving more freely, following his lead with increasing ease. "See?" Wade murmured, his eyes never leaving her face. "Your body remembers." As they turned in time to the music, Florence gradually became aware of a sensation she had almost forgotten: pleasure. Simple, uncomplicated pleasure in movement, in music, in the feeling of being held. It was both familiar and strange, like rediscovering a favorite book after years of absence. The waltz ended too soon, transitioning into a livelier tune. Wade paused, his questioning look asking if she wanted to continue. To her own surprise, Florence nodded, and they stayed for another dance, and then another. During a pause between songs, Florence realized she was smiling not broadly, but a small, genuine curve of her lips that felt foreign, yet right. Wade noticed too, his eyes widening slightly. "There it is," he said softly, his voice filled with something like wonder. "Even prettier than I imagined." Florence felt the smile falter under his attention, self-consciousness rushing back. Wade shook his head quickly. "Don't hide it," he urged. "It's like seeing the sun after a long winter." The band began a slower tune, and other couples around them drew closer together. Wade maintained his respectful distance, but Florence found herself wanting to step nearer. The realization startled her, and she pulled back instead. "I think I need some air," she said, suddenly feeling confined despite the open square. Wade nodded immediately. "Of course." He led her away from the dancers, toward a quieter street that ran alongside the square. The music was still audible but muted, and the night air felt cool against Florence's flushed skin. They walked slowly, side by side, neither speaking for several minutes. Florence was acutely aware of Wade's presence beside her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Thank you for the dances," she said finally, breaking the silence. "The pleasure was mine," Wade replied. "You dance beautifully." Florence looked up at the stars, brilliant in the clear desert sky. "I used to love dancing," she admitted. "Before," she trailed off, unwilling to complete the thought, but Wade seemed to understand. "Before whatever happened that brought you to Copper Creek," he finished for her. Florence nodded, keeping her eyes on the stars. "Florence," Wade said, his voice gentle but serious, "I won't ask you to tell me what happened. That's your story to share or keep private as you choose. But I want you to know that not everyone will hurt you the way you've been hurt before." The simple statement, delivered without pressure or expectation, made Florence's eyes burn with unexpected tears. She blinked them away quickly, not wanting him to see. "How can you be so certain?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Wade stopped walking, turning to face her. In the silver moonlight, his expression was earnest, his eyes holding hers with quiet intensity. "Because I've watched you these past weeks, your strength, your independence, the careful way you guard your heart, and all I've wanted is to see you smile, to know that somewhere inside, you still believe in joy." He paused, then added softly, "I would cut off my right arm before I'd be the cause of putting that light out again." The conviction in his voice was unmistakable, and Florence found herself believing him despite the walls she'd built around her trust. She didn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to respond to such a declaration. After a moment, Wade offered his arm. "Shall we head back? Or would you prefer I walk you home?" Florence considered. The evening had already exceeded her expectations, pushed her further outside her comfort than she'd been in years. Perhaps it was enough for one night. "Home, I think," she replied. Wade nodded, and they turned in the direction of her homestead. The walk was quiet but companionable, the distant sounds of the celebration fading behind them as they left town. At her gate, Wade stopped. "Thank you for coming tonight," he said. "For giving Copper Creek and me a chance." Florence looked up at him, this man who had waited patiently for a smile and asked for nothing more. In the moonlight, with the memory of their dances still fresh, she found the courage to speak a truth she had kept hidden. "My husband was not a kind man," she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could reconsider. He hurt me, in many ways. That's why I came here, why I keep to myself." Wade's expression remained steady, though she saw a flash of anger in his eyes, not directed at her but on her behalf. "Thank you for trusting me with that," he said simply. Florence nodded, grateful for his restraint, for not pressing for details or offering hollow sympathies. "Good night, Wade," she said, using his given name deliberately. "Good night, Florence," he replied. "Sweet dreams." As she watched him walk away, Florence touched her lips, feeling the lingering sensation of her smile. One step at a time, she thought, one small step back into the world. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to Florence's life. She began making the trip into town more frequently, no longer hurrying through her errands with her head down. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Coleman and other shopkeepers, even stopping occasionally for brief conversations. Wade visited her homestead every few days, always with a legitimate reason, bringing extra vegetables from the Carson ranch, offering to help with a repair, or simply passing by on his way to town. Their interactions grew more comfortable, marked by conversations that ranged from practical matters of ranch work and gardening to deeper discussions of books they had read and places they had seen. On one such visit in late August, Wade arrived with a small crate of peaches. "Carson's wife preserved more than they can eat," he explained. "Thought you might enjoy these." Florence accepted the gift with genuine pleasure. "Thank you. Peaches are my favorite." They sat on her porch steps, sharing one of the ripe fruits. The sweet juice dripped down Florence's fingers, and she laughed, actually laughed, when Wade pointed out a drop on her chin. The sound of her laughter seemed to freeze them both. It was the first time Wade had heard it, and for Florence, it was like rediscovering a part of herself she had believed dead. "I like that sound," Wade said softly. Florence wiped her chin, suddenly self-conscious. "It's been a while." "Too long," Wade agreed. He hesitated, then added, "Florence, there's something I should tell you." His serious tone made her tense. "What is it?" "The cattle drive season's starting soon. Carson's sending me north with a herd to the railhead in Cheyenne. I'll be gone for at least 2 months. The news shouldn't have affected her as strongly as it did. After all, Wade Yates had only been in her life for a short time, yet the thought of him leaving created a hollow feeling in her chest that was both surprising and alarming. "When do you leave?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "End of next week," he replied, watching her face carefully. Florence nodded, looking out at her garden rather than at him. "Well, I'm sure Carson values your experience. It's a good opportunity." "Florence," Wade said gently. "Look at me." She turned reluctantly, meeting his gaze. "I'll come back," he promised, "if you want me to." The simple statement hung between them, weighted with meaning. Did she want him to come back? The answer frightened her with its clarity. "I would like that," she admitted quietly. Wade's smile was slow and warm. "Then I'll come back." They sat in silence for a moment, the implications of this exchange settling around them. Then Wade reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. "I brought you something else," he said, "for while I'm gone." Florence took the book, running her fingers over the faded leather cover. "Poems by Tennyson," she read aloud. "It was my mother's," Wade explained. "Her favorite. I thought you might enjoy it." The gesture touched Florence deeply. To loan her something that had belonged to the mother he spoke of with such reverence was no small thing. "I'll take good care of it," she promised. Wade nodded. "I know you will." As he prepared to leave that day, Wade paused by his horse, turning back to her with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Florence, I'd like to call on you properly when I return," he said. "With your permission." The formal request, so at odds with the easy friendship they had developed, made her heart beat faster. "You mean—" "I mean I'd like to court you," Wade clarified, his eyes steady on hers. "If you're willing." Florence felt a momentary panic at the idea, old fears rising to the surface. But beneath the fear was something stronger, a desire to move forward, to trust again. "I think I might be willing to try," she said carefully, "when you return." Wade's smile was like sunrise breaking over the desert. That's all I ask. The day of Wade's departure arrived too quickly. Florence had not planned to see him off. Goodbyes were difficult, and she didn't want to intrude on Carson's business, but the morning found her walking into town anyway, drawn by the need to see Wade one last time before his journey. The cattle drive was assembling at the edge of town, a massive, dusty operation of bellowing cattle, shouting cowboys, and organized chaos. Florence spotted Wade immediately, mounted on his chestnut gelding, directing younger cowboys with calm authority. She stood at a distance, uncertain whether to approach, when Wade looked up and saw her. A smile broke across his face, and he immediately handed his responsibilities to another cowboy and rode over to her. "You came," he said, echoing his words from Founder's Day. Florence nodded. "I wanted to wish you safe travels." Wade dismounted, standing before her with his hat in his hands. "Thank you. That means a great deal." Around them, the preparations continued, with cowboys calling to each other and cattle lowing impatiently. Yet in that moment, it felt as if they stood in a pocket of stillness. "I've been reading the Tennyson," Florence said. "It's beautiful." "I'm glad you're enjoying it." Wade hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I have something else for you, something to remember me by." He held out a small object, a carved wooden rose, no bigger than a silver dollar but intricate in its detail, with delicate petals and a short stem. "I made it," he said almost shyly. "Not as pretty as a real flower, but it won't wither while I'm gone." Florence took the carving, amazed by its craftsmanship. "It's beautiful, Wade." "Thank you." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and this time Florence didn't pull away. Instead, impulsively, she leaned forward and placed a quick kiss on his cheek. "Come back safely," she whispered. Wade's eyes widened in surprise, then softened with emotion. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away." A shout from the cattle drive foreman broke the moment. Wade glanced over his shoulder, then back at Florence. "I have to go," he said reluctantly. Florence nodded, stepping back. "I know." Wade mounted his horse again, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart flutter. 2 months, he said. "Will you write to me? Carson's wife will forward letters." "Yes," Florence promised, "I will." With a final tip of his hat, Wade rode back to the herd. Florence stayed until the entire drive had moved out, watching until Wade's figure was just a distant speck on the horizon. As she walked home, she held the wooden rose carefully in her hand, thinking of the man who had carved it, the man who had waited patiently for her smile, and now waited for her trust. For the first time in years, Florence Blackburn found herself looking forward to the future. The weeks of Wade's absence passed more slowly than Florence had anticipated. She filled her days with work tending her garden, completing sewing orders, preserving vegetables for the coming winter, but the evenings stretched long and quiet without his occasional visits. True to her word, Florence wrote to him. Her first letter was tentative, formal, a careful account of town happenings and weather patterns. But as the weeks passed, her letters grew more personal. She wrote about books she was reading, memories of her childhood in Denver, and eventually, hesitantly, about her growing feelings for him. Wade's replies came less frequently due to the nature of the cattle drive, but when they arrived, Florence read them multiple times, tracing his bold handwriting with her fingertips. His letters were straightforward, yet tender, full of stories from the trail and constant reassurances of his eagerness to return to Copper Creek to her. As September turned to October, Florence found herself counting the days until his expected return. She had placed the wooden rose on her bedside table, where it was the last thing she saw before sleeping and the first thing she saw upon waking. Mrs. Coleman noticed the change in Florence during her visits to the general store. "You're blooming, dear," she said one afternoon as Florence selected fabric for a new dress, "like a flower after a long drought." Florence felt her cheeks warm. I'm well," she replied, not quite ready to discuss her feelings openly. Mrs. Coleman smiled knowingly. "Mr. Yates should be back any day now, according to Mrs. Carson." "Yes," Florence acknowledged, unable to hide the anticipation in her voice. The drive was successful from what he wrote. I'm glad, Mrs. Coleman said, patting Florence's hand, for the drive and for whatever is growing between you two. That evening, as Florence worked on her new dress, a warm rust color that complemented her auburn hair, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the solitary existence she had accepted for so long. The possibility both thrilled and terrified her. Thomas's ghost still lingered in her memory, a shadow that occasionally whispered doubts in her ear. But increasingly, Wade's steady presence in her thoughts, his patience, his kindness, his respect for her independence, helped quiet those whispers. 3 days later, Florence was hanging laundry when she heard the now familiar sound of hoofbeats approaching. Her heart leapt, but she forced herself to continue her task, not wanting to appear too eager. Only when the horse and rider came into view did she turn, her hands stilling on the damp sheet she had been hanging. Wade sat atop his chestnut gelding, dusty and trail-worn but smiling at the sight of her. "You're back," she said, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. Wade dismounted, approaching the fence with the same respectful distance he had always maintained. "Promised I would be." They stood looking at each other for a long moment, 2 months of separation creating a strange shyness between them despite their letters. "You look well," Wade said finally. "Beautiful as ever." Florence smiled, a full, genuine smile that came easier now than it had in years. "You look tired," she replied honestly, "and in need of a bath." Wade laughed, the sound warming her more than the October sun. "Direct as always. I've missed that about you." "Would you like to come in?" Florence asked, surprising herself with the invitation. "I have coffee." "I'd like nothing better," Wade replied. "Let me just see to my horse first." Florence went inside to prepare the coffee, her hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. When Wade entered a few minutes later, having removed his dusty coat and hat, the small cabin seemed to shrink around his tall frame. They sat at her table, mugs of steaming coffee between them, and Wade told her about the drive, the challenges of crossing rivers with stubborn cattle, the beauty of the Wyoming territory, the satisfaction of delivering the herd safely to the railhead. "But the whole time," he said, his voice softening, "I was thinking about coming back here." Florence met his gaze, finding nothing but sincerity in his eyes. "I'm glad you did," she admitted. Wade reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of hers. "Florence, I meant what I said before I left. I'd like to court you properly, if you'll allow it." Florence looked at his outstretched hand, then slowly placed her own in it. Wade's fingers closed gently around hers, warm and solid. "I would like that," she said quietly. The smile that spread across Wade's face was worth every moment of fear she had overcome to speak those words. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked, "after I've had that bath you suggested." Florence laughed, the sound coming more naturally now. "Yes, you may." True to his word, Wade began courting Florence with a respectful formality that touched her deeply. He visited her homestead regularly, always bringing small tokens of his affection, wildflowers, a book of poetry he had found in town, once even a kitten from a litter born in the Carson barn, which Florence named Tennyson in honor of the book Wade had loaned her. Their courtship progressed slowly, each step forward a victory over the fear that still occasionally gripped Florence's heart. The first time Wade held her hand as they walked along the creek near her property. The first time she shared the full story of her marriage to Thomas and her escape to Copper Creek, Wade listening with quiet attention, his anger on her behalf controlled but evident in the tightening of his jaw. The first time he kissed her, a gentle, questioning press of his lips against hers that left her breathless and wanting more. As winter approached, Florence found herself thinking of Wade constantly, his smile, his steady hands, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words were precious to him. She thought of his patience, waiting for her smile that first day, and every day since, never pushing, but always inviting her to step further into the light. On a crisp November evening, as they sat before the fire in her cabin after sharing a meal she had prepared, Wade took her hand in his. "Florence," he said, his voice serious, "these past months have been the happiest of my life." She smiled, still marveling at how easily the expression came now. "Mine too," she admitted. Wade's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. I've been offered a permanent position with Carson Foreman of his North Range. It would mean a steady income, a future I could build on. He paused, his eyes seeking hers. A future I hope to build with you. Florence's heart quickened. What are you saying, Wade? He shifted from his chair to kneel before her, still holding her hand. I'm saying I love you, Florence Blackburn. I've loved you since I saw you walking through town that first day, holding yourself so carefully apart from the world. I love your strength, your determination, the way you've learned to smile and laugh again despite everything you've endured. Tears filled Florence's eyes as Wade continued. I'm asking if you would do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife. Not to take care of you, you've proven you can do that yourself, but to stand beside you, to face whatever comes together, to build a life filled with all the joy and laughter you deserve. Florence looked into the face of this man who had waited so patiently for her to heal, who had never asked for more than she could give, who had shown her that love could be kind and respectful rather than controlling. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, I will marry you, Wade Yates. Wade's face transformed with joy. He rose enough to gather her in his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they parted, Florence was surprised to see tears in his eyes as well. I promise you, he said fervently, that I will spend every day of our life together, ensuring you never regret this decision. Florence touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I know you will, she said, and I promise to keep smiling for you every day. Wade smiled back, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she had come to love. That's all I ever wanted, he said, before drawing her into another kiss that felt like coming home. They were married in December, a small ceremony in the Copper Creek Church with Mrs. Coleman, the Carsons, and a few other townsfolk as witnesses. Florence wore a new dress of deep blue, and Wade wore his best suit with a matching blue tie. When they spoke their vows, Florence's voice was clear and strong, her smile radiant as she promised herself to this man who had taught her to trust again. Their first home was a cabin on the Carson property, larger than Florence's homestead and closer to Wade's work. But they kept her land too, Wade recognizing how important that symbol of independence was to her. Together, they worked to improve both properties, combining their strengths and supporting each other through challenges. Spring found them preparing a garden twice the size of Florence's original plot, with Wade turning the soil while Florence planned the layout of vegetables and flowers. As they worked side by side in the warm afternoon sun, Wade paused to watch his wife carefully planting tomato seedlings. Happy? He asked simply. Florence looked up, pushing a strand of hair from her face with the back of her wrist to avoid getting dirt on her skin. The smile she gave him was full and unguarded, reaching all the way to her eyes. Yes, she said, the single word containing multitudes of meaning. Very happy. Wade crossed the freshly turned earth to kneel beside her, not caring about the dirt on his trousers as he leaned in to kiss her. Florence's hands, still careful of the dirt, hovered at his shoulders as she returned the kiss with equal fervor. When they parted, Wade rested his forehead against hers. Who would have thought, he murmured, that all it would take was patience and a wooden rose to win the heart of the most beautiful woman in Arizona territory? Florence laughed, the sound free and joyful in a way that still sometimes surprised her. Don't forget the roofing shingles, she teased. Those were very persuasive. Wade grinned, pulling back to look at her face. I told you I'd wait until you smiled, he said. Best wait of my life. As they returned to their planting, working together to create something that would grow and flourish, Florence reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the darkness of her past to this moment of simple, profound happiness, it had been a path of small steps, of learning to trust again, of rediscovering the woman she had been before fear closed her off from joy. And beside her through it all had been Wade, patient and steady, waiting for her smile and asking for nothing more than the chance to love her as she deserved to be loved. That evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Florence rested her head on Wade's shoulder, content in a way she had once believed impossible. Thank you, she said softly. Wade's arm tightened around her. For what? For waiting, Florence replied. For seeing the person I could be when I had forgotten her myself. Wade pressed a kiss to the top of her head. I'll always see you, Florence. All of you, the strength and the vulnerability, the serious and the joyful. And I'll keep waiting, every day, for whatever you're ready to share. As darkness fell around them and the stars appeared in the vast Arizona sky, Florence Blackburn Yates smiled into the future, no longer afraid of what it might hold, because whatever came, she would face it with the man who had waited for her smile and won her heart in the waiting.